Greetings, YouTube. This is Remarkable Republican here once again to bring you the truth with the truth-flavored bias. Today we're going to take a look at Yakuza 5. Released in 2012, Yakuza 5 is the sixth game in the series, since someone at Sega decided to start counting with 0, as is the custom in the Orient. And Yakuza 4, the gimmick is that you had 4 playable characters. Here, it's the same gimmick, but you get 5 characters. One of them's a girl who doesn't fight, so that was dumb, and one of the other characters is pretty much garbage. But why should Sega let quality concerns prevent their pursuit of quantity? Of course, the only quality Sega pursues in this series is the quantity called the Kami and Queer Agenda. Let's break down and analyze what is easily the most degenerate game in the series so far. What we're going to do is go character by character as we switch characters over the course of this excessively long game. So when we start out, we're with Kiryu. He is now living under the alias of Suzuki. So I guess he is a big car fan. And of course, because of his name, they decided it would be funny if he were a taxi driver. So get it, Suzuki, taxi. Anyway, he's living in a city called Fukuoka. The thing is, he's trying to live incognito, and we learn that later. But because he's Kiryu, and because he doesn't change his appearance except by just wearing sort of blue-collar guy clothes, he still has the hair gel and everything else, everybody knows immediately who he is, at least all the Yakuza and Underworld types. So they just look at him, and they know exactly that this is the guy that punched out a tiger and fought the CIA and did all the other stuff he did in the previous games. So they're well aware that he was the Tojo clan leader. So at one point early in the game, before really the action started, he got attacked and beaten really badly by a bunch of bad guys. And then a hot local hostess named Mayumi nursed him back to health. Now he didn't know it, but she was the daughter of the leader of the Yamagasa family, which was the local power player in Fukuoka. And so he was being monitored by effectively a spy who lived with him. He also hangs out with a dorky boss who likes to get drunk and try to use Suzuki as bait for women. He also races as taxi, which seems kind of irresponsible and should have gotten him fired, but I guess if you get drunk with your boss, you can get away with that. And the most memorable moment is he fights about 100 guys by himself, because, that's something that a normal taxi driver can do that won't give away his identity at all. And later on, he will meet with his old friend and the new leader of the Tojo, Daigo Dojima, who invites him back to Kamurocho. So this story is actually relatively coherent in most ways, but there are some major issues here, and once again, we see that Sega is trying to promote degeneracy. As is almost always the case with Kiryu, he is trying very hard and not succeeding at concealing his homosexuality. He has what can only be described as an ironic reason for rejecting Mayumi, namely that she wasn't who she said she was. She deceived him. Because he was so honest. His name is really Suzuki, and he lives for driving taxis. So that's a really dumb reason, and it's an obvious way to get out of admitting his own homosexuality by pretending that he's morally outraged by a small act of deception that clearly she didn't get a say in. Mayumi is in love with him by now. She's taken care of him, she's lived with him, and most likely his unavailable emotional nature is kind of making her want him more, since she's used to being drooled over by dudes at clubs. She also accepts him for who he is. So how can he find a woman like this who accepts him for who he is and is not bothered at all by his Yakuza background? But he never really shows any interest in her. He doesn't even pay her attention. He's not grateful for what she did to him. So he is just blowing her off, and it's largely because he is in fact a homosexual. Later on, he goes back to Kamurocho, which again undermines everything that he is in hiding for. We'll get into his reasons for being in hiding, but he gets drawn out very easily. And of course, an additional motive for leaving Fukuoka is so that way he can avoid having to be around Mayumi and having to come up with even more ridiculous excuses about why he doesn't want to be with her when it's a pretty great deal for him, at least in theory, at least if he were straight. So all roads lead him back to Kamurocho, which is the most degenerate red light district in Japan, where I'm sure it's not that hard to find a guy in a bathhouse. We learned about Saejima in Yakuza 0, and then also we play as him in 4, so he makes a comeback, and the story at the beginning is that he has to go back to prison to finish out the last few years of his 18 counts sentence from back in the 80s. So back in the 80s he was convicted for killing 18 people. We learned that this was false, however, but because the law is insistent upon putting the Yakuza in their place, he has to go back and finish out a few more years. Also, the fact that he only got 20-something years for killing 18 people, that's kind of crazy when you think about it, and this explains a lot about why Japan still has so many problems with their mafia. Anyway, it starts out with him doing a sort of warm-up battle with Majima, and then he goes to prison. He now starts getting bullied despite being the biggest guy there, and he's going to continue to tough it out, but then he learns that Majima's been murdered because of a newspaper article that says so, and so he decides to break out with one of his friends. When he breaks out, their escape attempt goes awry. His friend ends up getting killed, and so he ends up taking refuge with a hunter who's an older guy who's been injured. He kills a bunch of bears, which is not at all symbolism for something, and then he goes to hang out in the city of Sukamino, which is located in the north of Japan. His investigation then leads him back to Kamurocho because he thinks that this is where Majima was killed or where his killers were. So that's his basic story. Now let's talk about the problems with Saejima and his story and what Sega's trying to promote by having you play through all of this horse shit. The use of 18 counts to describe Saejima and how it became his nickname can give us a clue as to what this guy is into, and also what might have gotten him back in prison for real. So at this point, the court system knew damn well that he had not killed 18 people, and his supposed crime was breaking out of prison. But given also that he diffused a dangerous situation in Tokyo, you'd think that they would let him get away with it, or make him pay a fine, or some other way to get around this. So making him go back to prison implies that he actually did something that deserved jail. And there is a crime where you'd go to jail after a court sentencing, and where there might be a gap between the court date and going to jail, and that crime is statutory rape of a minor. Well, the 18 and the 18 counts gives you an idea of the problem with the age of his lovers. I'll leave it at that. We also see that at the beginning, right before Saejima goes to jail, Majima is concerned that he's going to have to fend for himself in prison. And what class of criminals gets attacked in prison? It's almost always child molesters. Now, while Saejima is probably mostly dating teenagers, he's still technically a pedophile. So we see that Majima, when he's sort of training him, is depressed, and you might think it's because his friend's going to prison, but in reality it's because his lover has cheated on him with minors, and he's afraid they won't get a chance to reconcile because his lover will be killed before he does the time for his crime. He also just seems disappointed in Saejima, and he refuses to partake in the little skirmish with him. He says there's no point. So he clearly doesn't want to come into physical contact. And for Majima, that's really weird. Majima is all about fighting and also all about physical contact with dudes, because Majima is the super queer. So later on in Saejima's story, as we mentioned, he plays house and serves as a lumberjack with an old dude, and he hunts bears. So effectively what this is symbol for is that Saejima himself is a bear. He's a large homosexual male. And so he is killing all the rivals who could take this old man from him. And the old man is kind of just a rebound because he believes that his true love, Majima, is gone. So this is a kind of big simile, the killing of the bears, for what is really happening. He also has these really weird dreams in prison about attending cabaret clubs. And given that these are not sex dreams, they're just dreams about sitting around talking and drinking with women, it's very strange, and it's almost as if the only way that he can imagine himself with a woman is if he is protected by being in a dream, if he's disassociated from himself and from reality. So this is a kind of ghostly beard. Now that he knows that something's happened to his one true love, Majima, perhaps he's thinking about whether he can fake being a heterosexual long enough to procreate. Maybe he wants to have kids to alleviate the loneliness. or to provide a better cover, because he knows once he gets out of jail, with Majima gone, he no longer has a big stake in the Tojo clan. So those are the real things going on with the Saejima mission. And now we learn that Sega doesn't understand how pacing works, because right in the middle of the game, now that you're many hours in, you take up your third character, and the story really starts to drag. So you play as Haruka, who by this time is maybe 16 or 17 or whatever she is, and she's trying to become an idol in the city of Sotenbori. So she spends all of her time doing dopey local television shows where she runs and talks about like food she likes, and then she does interviews. She sings and dances. She even has a few sort of street dance battles because that has become a thing for some reason in the city. And she is under the tutelage of a teacher slash manager, Mirei Park. And Mirei is a major slave driver. Mirei is really driving Haruka hard and wants to make a lot of money off of her. Haruka also has a lot of trouble fitting in, and she doesn't get along with the other girls that she's hanging out with, either the ones at her new school or the other girls who are in this sort of idol thing. So Haruka, possibly because Mirei's making life difficult for her, is supposed to be the victim. But if you look at how no one is nice to Haruka, it's pretty clear that she's the problem, and the game is just kind of trying to bend the narrative a bit to try to appease her, because of course she is Kiryu's stepdaughter. Later, Park gets murdered before Haruka is set to debut at the Tokyo Dome. So Park has been pressing Haruka to appear at the Tokyo Dome, which is the largest venue. And in theory, this would make Haruka kind of like the Taylor Swift of Japan. But with Park being murdered, her story kind of comes to a halt for a minute, and we'll get to how it picks up in just a little bit. But the first and most important task is to talk about the morality of Yakuza 5 and Haruka's section in it. So, if we think about what Mirei Park represents, we learn later that she is the ex-wife of Goro Majima, the super queer of the Yakuza series. Mirei Park is the definition of a woman scorned. She has been left by a man who left her for another man, or really a series of men, and she's very bitter about this. And so she takes out her anger any way she can. When she found out that Haruka wanted to be an idol, she then met with her and realized that her stepfather was none other than Kiryu, who was one of the men that Majima cheated on her with. And so she decided that she was going to take out at least a little bit of revenge on Kiryu, because she could have found a way to prevent Haruka's background from coming to light by just letting her operate under a stage name. Because if you think about it, if she just doesn't use the name Haruka Saka Yuka or whatever her last name was, then people can't really look up, oh, that's the stepdaughter of Kiryu who lived at this orphanage. So just give her a fake name, problem solved. Kiryu can stay in Okinawa with the kids, but Mirei is very vindictive, and so she wants to instead destroy Kiryu's life while using Haruka to become her meal ticket. Of course, there's also a backstory we learn about where she'd gotten pregnant and then she got an abortion to disguise the fact that she was married to Majima. Majima was angry and apparently hit her and then divorced her. Well, of course we know there's more going on because we know Majima. And we also know that with Park, because she did successfully cover up what had happened, that clearly the problem was not Majima in terms of preventing her from being an idol, but just because she was never talented enough or hot enough to do it. And so she was just kind of mid. So in many ways, she's just trying to live her dream through Haruka, and she's still angry with Majima and all of his associates, the people who led him not only down a path of criminal behavior, but also a path of homosexual behavior. So like I said, the idea that there were 5 characters is in many ways just a pure gimmick, because really the Haruka section is half controlled by Shun Akiyama. So Akiyama was a character from Yakuza 4. He happens to be in Sotenbori because he's opening a new branch of his finance company. And he also is the financial backer of Mirei Park, so he probably wants to keep an eye on her since he gave her a ridiculous amount of money. Well, while he's around looking for new clients, he gets a call that Mirei Park has been murdered, and so he shows up to Haruka's studio and recognizes her as Kiryu's stepdaughter, so he gets involved in the story that way. He also wanders around the city and does breakdance competitions with old ballerinas and other people. And in general, his reasons for being there are kind of vague, and his story as a whole just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So he gets sucked into something, and rather than simply just calling Kiryu, he decides to go get involved with the Yakuza himself. He also is rich, so he could just hire people to help him out with these fights, but instead he does all the fighting himself. So I don't really understand Akiyama's story or his motives. He doesn't have the personal connection quite like he did in the last game. And this is just terrible, terrible writing. But let's talk about the moral problems here, not just the fact that the story sucks. So in the game, Akiyama is presented as this kind of selfless guy who just wants to make other people's dreams come true, but also challenge them, and all of his loans are interest-free. The problem is there's no loan shark in the world who's like that, and it doesn't make sense, and he always gets himself involved in shady shit. So Akiyama's clearly kind of a sleazebag. He also ran some cabaret clubs in the last game, and while he is not a homosexual necessarily, he does clearly have something of a crush on Kiryu. I don't know whether it's a man crush or whether it's a romantic crush, but he certainly looks up to Kiryu in ways that are a bit embarrassing for an adult male to confess. And so he figures out that he now has a chance to not only protect his investment, but get in good with Kiryu, get to meet him again, get to hang out with him, bask in the greatness. And my guess is that because Haruka is supposed to be, a rising young starlet, and she's supposed to be beautiful and all that, and Akiyama clearly enjoys being showy and flashy and all that, I think that he's trying to groom her. Because he will sort of be her moral support, but in a way where he's kind of deniable, like he could say he's mothering or fathering her, but also he's being supportive the way a guy who wants to date somebody is. And so I think what he's trying to get at ultimately is to win over Haruka and Kiryu, and then date or even marry Haruka at a later time, and then use that as a way to sort of become Kiryu's true heir. So it's pretty selfish and self-centered, and it contradicts what he's supposed to stand for. And again, this the only thing that really makes sense if you think about how loose his connection to the story is, and how he just kind of stumbles into this shit, and there's no reason for him to commit the way that he does unless he sees something for himself out of all this. It's also worth mentioning that in the final battle, they fully expect that at least one of the great heroes here will die. So why would Akiyama put his life on the line unless he thought that there was going to be a major payday, or if there's going to be some goal that he can only achieve by participating in this absolute nonsense? Last and by far least, we have the story of Shinada. So Shinada was a former baseball player. He was drafted as a rookie, and it looked like things would go well for him, but then he got banned from the league on cheating allegations, and of course those allegations were not true, but it's easy to see why people believe them given that Shinada is a total loser. He's also a high school classmate of Daigo Dojima, so he's someone who has at least a little bit of a connection with somebody who's powerful. Now, he did not know Dojima back in high school, and he apparently was afraid of him because he knew that Dojima's dad was a big deal with the Tojo. And they haven't really spoken since high school, if they ever spoke at all. So Shinada is now down on his luck, and he is told by an anonymous source that turns out to be Daigo Dojima that he was banned for shady Yakuza reasons, and that he should investigate why he's banned and undo the ban. The game also is not super clear on whether Shinada would make a baseball comeback. Sure, he's getting a little old, but he can still play, apparently. And so it turns out that this ban of Shinada was part of a super complex, I would say unnecessarily complex, plot to keep the Omi and Tojo at bay and out of this local city where he's living, which I believe is called Wyvern. Or at least that's what I think is happening. The story here is really fucking dumb, and I'm not even sure how it connects back to the main story back in Tokyo. But again, Yakuza 5 is not exactly a masterpiece of clarity. Anyway, let's get into the morality and the problems of Shinada, which are endless. The thing with Shinada is that he is an outright degenerate. So with a lot of the other characters, they have sort of a super masculine veneer where they keep their skeletons in the closet, or at least try to. Shinada is very open about his degeneracy. So for one, he's deeply in debt, and he hardly ever pays his bills, and when he does, it's always late. He also has an ongoing relationship. It's not clear if he pays for it or whether he just gets it, but there is a woman named Milky who's an aging prostitute, and he likes to go to her to get pegged. So he's into being humiliated and made subordinate and doing some things that code as gay, but he does them with women, so I think he's just kind of a general purpose pervert. I don't really know if he has an identifiable sexual orientation beyond that. He also makes his living, such as it is, by writing porn. And he sort of casually mentions that at one point. The thing is, that is not a very good way to make a living, not only because most men don't read porn, they watch it. So if he really wanted to get by in the porn industry, he should just do porn. Maybe be a producer, a director, or an actor in porn. That'd make a lot more sense. He would probably be able to pay his bills at least. But instead, he writes porn stories. Or if he's going to write, why not write about sports? Now, sure, because he's disgraced and banned from the league, they might not want to see his name on a byline, but he could use a pseudonym. It seems like in this universe, only Kiryu is aware of the possibility you could use a fake name. It seems that no one else ever thought of this fucking idea before. So anyway, Shinada's writing porn stories, and he's struggling to get by financially, so because women are into porn stories, either he sucks at writing or he's writing something that's less popular like gay porn. So my suspicion is that because he's into pegging, that's sort of a way for him to do research on gay porn. When we look at Shinada's fighting style, he also is a grappler despite being a striker by nature because again he's a baseball player and he was known for his batting skills. So I guess he didn't really play a position like outfielder. I think he was just a straight up batter from what I gather. Either that or maybe it's the only part of his game that's left. I'm not sure. He also is sort of weirdly friendly and flirtatious almost with the kids at the batting cages. And also with his loan shark, who's an older guy. They also have some, like, chemistry, I guess you could call it. So Shinada seems like the kind of guy who would stick his dick in a cigarette lighter on a car. You know, like, he's the kind of guy who is, what was the phrase? Ambisexual. So instead of being ambidextrous, he's ambisexual. He would just do whatever it takes to get his rocks off, and he doesn't really care with who or what. So, I mean, even though clearly he didn't do the cheating scandal, he probably would have gotten himself in trouble anyway. He'd probably have lost his endorsements and his contract at some point in his career because look at the kind of guy this is. And also, his backup plan was to write porn. He didn't go coach baseball or play overseas or anything like that. I mean, there's all kinds of things he could have done other than writing porn. Like, this is ridiculous. Anyway, turns out that, of course, the informant who told him that he was cheated was Tojo chairman Daigo Dojima, his old high school classmate. And when Dojima shows up, he's wearing a COVID mask as a disguise. So this shows that COVID masks, of course, are mainly used as disguises, not as medical instruments. But also, this mask, which is a COVID mask, is in a game made in 2012. And I want you to think about that. So I've been telling you guys for a long time, Sega has connections. So the things that you see in Sega games are not accidents. These are not reflections of our culture. This is Sega trying to guide our culture. This is Sega trying to dictate our culture. And Sega knew about the pandemic 8 years before it happened. So just think about that. 8 years before it happened, Sega was aware that COVID was coming down the pike because it was the plandemic after all, as those of us who know. The finale of this game is not super exciting because it is a bunch of loosely connected stories, and now they're going to try to prevent a bombing at the Tokyo Dome. And Kiryu is going to allow his stepdaughter Haruka to perform, even though there's going to be a bombing or assassination attempt, which seems like not very good parenting to me. But anyhow, they meet at the new Serena bar, which is where Kiryu had his previous lovers, such as Nishikayama and the woman from the first game. And so this is a site that's special to Kiryu. I'm sure that, of course, Akiyama was excited to be there with his hero, and even though Akiyama usually doesn't seem very gay, I'm sure he would make an exception for Kiryu if he invited them into the back room at New Serena. Um, so they meet up there, and they go out and finish the fight. Well, it turns out that Majima was never dead, and so Saejima has to confront Majima. They're forced to fight each other because the snipers trained on them, and then they reconcile and take the opportunity to fight their enemies off. Now, even though the gay romance of their relationship is uncomfortable, I do think this part of the game was well done. It's actually the only good part of the finale, if we're being completely honest, when they have this epic moment where they kind of turn and start fighting these gunmen after they've lulled them into this like false sense of security. As for Shinada, he helps prevent the bombing, and he remains a waste of a character. I don't give a fuck what anybody says. This fifth character should have just been Daigo Dojima. He was there already. But then again, I mean, my idea is to make a good game, and Sega's just trying to promote Degeneracy. But anyway, you should have just had Daigo Dojima do some stuff. We already know he was wandering around because we saw him with Shinada. We also saw him earlier visiting Kiryu. So Daigo Dojima clearly was on the prowl at this time. Akiyama will fight Kanai. I assume that's how you say his name. He's the guy who ran the rival talent agency and was responsible for murdering Mirei Park. And the only reason why he does this is because it's, I guess, to nerf his cool factor. Also, it further unmans Majima, that Majima, didn't get to avenge his ex-wife. Because even though obviously Majima's not really into women, still he was good friends with her at one point, and he also had been friends with Kanai. So they had been a sort of a trio. And then later, after Majima divorced her and moved back to Kamurocho, connived and betrayed and murdered Miri, so you would think that Majima would make things right. So this should have been like sequential, where Saejima frees Majima, and then Majima, I don't know, like gets an energy drink and then goes to take out Kanai, or at least does part of the battle with Kanai. But instead, everything's happening all at once, so they kind of fucked that up. And of course, Kiryu fights the leader of all this, the guy who's really pulling all the strings of this grand conspiracy that involves baseball in the 80s, or excuse me, 90s, and everything else. And Kiryu defeats that guy, and then we all go home, and the good guys won. But of course, we know these aren't really good guys. These are all degenerates, and they just defeated other people who are basically decent people. We have no reason to believe that there's any real character flaws with the bad guys here. They might have done a few things that are technically illegal, but what have they done, or what do they do or believe that is a threat to society as a whole? Well, it's hard to see anything. And I support the banning of Shinada from professional Japanese baseball. This man is a menace, and he would have just used his wealth for horrible things. Can you imagine how many people would have been sex trafficked if Shinada became a millionaire? I mean, so I sort of think this is a game where if you really think about it for more than a minute, you realize that you helped a group of bad guys, including an escaped criminal, defeat a group of people who might be flawed, but ultimately wanted what was best for Japan. I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, signing out.